Yeah, thank you again to the Kai Hack Night team for having us on. We're super excited. Thank you to everybody looking at the presentation on YouTube. We're also super excited for you to see what we're doing at Omelas, the great work that we're doing. So as I said, we are with a company called Omelas, and today we're going to talk about combating digital influence operations by state actors. So very quick introduction, the virtual voice that you're hearing right now, that's mine. I'm Roberto. I'm a data scientist at Omelas, and with me is the great Mr. Nick Talant, who's our senior data engineer at Omelas. We're both UChicago CAP alums, which is the Computational Analysis and Public Policy program. And we have been, at least myself, we've been at Kai Hack Night quite a few times. I'm very excited about the in-person meetings coming back together. And that's why we're presenting here. So we both work for Omelas, which is a cybersecurity and analytics company that focuses on tracking overt influence campaigns with the goal of helping protect democracy both at home and abroad. So today, quick outline, we're gonna be talking about what digital influence campaigns are. Specifically, we're gonna look at two case studies. One is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, COVID-19 coverage. The second one that Nick will talk about is Russia's 2020 US election operations. And then in these two, we'll highlight some common patterns and common methods that are used in these influence campaigns. We'll then jump into how we at Omelas try to combat these digital influence campaigns with our data and our methods. So without further ado, let me jump into the real meat of the presentation. So first off, we'll start with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, their COVID-19 coverage. So on the right, you can see our white paper viral overload, where we reported on the CCP COVID-19's coverage during the first half of 2020, so at the very beginning of the pandemic. And during this first half of the pandemic, the CCP was mainly focused on really highlighting their ability and capacity to quickly and efficiently control the spread of the virus in their own borders, so within China. In addition to that, they were also very interested in highlighting how quickly they were able to get their economy to get back on track by stamping out the spread of the virus. Here you see on the left a Twitter from China Xinhua, which is a Chinese-owned media organization. And as you can see, they're trying to really show this image of things getting more or less back to normal, with doctors and medical workers being very happy, waving, and people getting back on buses, transportation starting to get back to normal again. So in addition to really highlighting their strength, China really wanted to broadcast how this Chinese model for pandemic control had, in their telling, really won the applause from the international community. Now, not only did they want to just highlight their own strengths, but they've also been quite interested in showing the weaknesses of democracies in how they've managed the virus in their own country. So this is the Global Times, an opinion piece from the Global Times, which is another CCP-owned media organization. And in this piece, they're trying to make the argument that not only have democracies, or did democracies in general, really fail to control the virus in their own countries, they were ill-equipped to handle the coronavirus, but the reason that they were so ill-equipped in the CCP's telling is because of the system of government. So what they're doing here is really drawing a line between the Chinese non-democratic government system and saying that it was just much more well-equipped than all of the Western democracies for emergency management. So here you see a direct quote taken from this opinion piece that says, considering China's efforts and the WHO's warnings, which gave the world more than a month for preparedness. Why has the West still failed to prevent the epidemic? Ultimately, it's a result of their governance system. So they're really highlighting how democracy as a system of government is just not well designed for emergency management. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic evolved, and thankfully we got quite a few vaccines through just terrific scientific innovation all across the world, the CCP really started to shift their coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic into talking much more about the role that China played worldwide as a humanitarian hero, first sending doctors and aid to developing and developed countries, and then really the role they played in vaccinating the world. So as many of you have heard, the term vaccine diplomacy. So here what I'm showing is Wolf Totem, which is our dashboard. And this is for the period of April 2021 to August 2021. And it's for only Chinese media that we track. And you see on your right, we have these stories, which are basically clusters of content of articles that we aggregate based on a common theme or a common topic. We'll actually talk at the end of the presentation of the actual methodology of how we do these stories. But for now, the important thing is that 3 out of these 7 top stories for that 4-month period were all about 2 things. One, how China was really leading the world in vaccinating and helping other countries vaccinate their populations. And 2, again, highlighting how the West was just mired in problems in their own vaccination efforts. As you see, the very first story is about problems with Moderna vaccines in Japan. So one common method that governments, actors, organizations really use in these operations is called information laundering. So information laundering refers to the method in which these states and actors kind of weave factual information with conspiracy theories and unbacked claims to grant these unbacked claims legitimacy. And they make this method in order to really make it very hard for readers to differentiate between what might be just factual information and then what might be propaganda, which is information that has an agenda, in our case, has very clear geopolitical goals. So here we're looking at 3 examples from CGTN, another Chinese-owned organization. And we see the first 2, one talking about New Zealand's COVID strategy and how they're focusing more on vaccines now. And then the second one about when the FDA approved the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. Now, these 2 are pretty factual. And the third one, though, is promoting this conspiracy theory of the virus origins being in the US Fort Detrick lab. So in our analysis, we've actually found that the CCP has been repeatedly spreading the unbacked claim through most of its news channels. And it's actually increased reporting on this US Fort Detrick conspiracy theory as more and more pressure grew in the international community to have a more in-depth investigation about the virus origins. Now, it's actually interesting in our own analysis, we've also found that as CCP-backed media organizations started to talk about this US Fort Detrick conspiracy, other countries such as Russia, Iran, Venezuela, they really jumped on this train and started spreading this same narrative themselves. We managed to track this claim of US Fort Detrick. We tracked it back to a Canadian think tank called the Center for Global Research on Globalization. And to get an idea, this think tank very often promotes climate denialism, vaccine hesitancy, and many other controversial views. So in these 2 examples that we just saw, CGTN and Global Times, they are Chinese-owned media organizations, which are under the direct purview. The CGTN is under a direct purview of the City Council the People's Republic of China, and the Global Times, which is part of the People's Daily, is directly under the International Department for the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So these China, as we'll see, Russia as well, non-democratic countries in general, they really exert total control over domestic mass media. And they do it by really vastly funding information and propaganda operations abroad. So in 2017, it's reported that China had around 10 billion US dollars allocated for information operations abroad. You don't really have to quote me on this. You can quote the president of China, Xi Jinping, who recently said, the media must love the party, protect the party, and closely align themselves with the party in leadership, thought, politics, and action. Now, these 5 media organizations that we see here, CGTN, China Daily, the Global Times, they are actually the 5 most followed news pages on Facebook. They're all CCP owned. Here I'm actually only showing these 4 that, in addition to being in the top 5, they're the 4 most followed news pages on Facebook. They're, as I said, all CCP owned. But not only that, they're also all in the top 25 most followed Facebook pages worldwide. So China really has a humongous footprint on Western-based social media platforms through which they can spread their information, their propaganda, just about everything. And I just want to note here, it's important to remember that Facebook is actually banned in China. So all followers of these pages come from outside Chinese territory. One thing I think is important to take away from this presentation is just the vast scale of these operations. And while most of these media organizations report mostly in English, they have a growing report group in other languages, such as Spanish and Arabic, that we also follow. So to drive home the point of just how enormous their operations are on Western-based social media platforms, here are a couple of other numbers. So the top five Chinese English language news sources that I just talked about, they combined have 436 million followers on Facebook, which is just really an enormous amount. They have 45 million Twitter followers and 3.8 million Instagram followers. So through these channels, the CCP has really managed to use Western social media platforms. I know there's been a lot on the news criticizing platforms such as Facebook for other reasons, but here is just, I guess, one more straw to add to that criticism. And the CCP and other autocratic governments have really managed to use this as a megaphone to broadcast their own approved information. So with that, I will hand it over to Nick, who is going to talk about Russia.
Great, thank you. I also want to say thank you to our hosts. I actually had my first hack night in 2017 in October. So going down to Braintree. So I never thought I would be presenting. So really excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about Russian I/O, and really what my goal here is to kind of give you just a high level understanding of what Russian I/O looks like, because it's been fairly consistent over the past few years. So we're going to specifically be talking about 2020 and then it continuing into 2021. So the big thing for Russian I/O is scale and spectacle. So they too have a really healthy budget, over $1.3 billion, which is ridiculous. And it's a key part of Russian national strategy and a foreign policy to have this vast media landscape and ecosystem of spectacular content for people to get engaged with. They publish in any given day more than News Corp and CNN combined. I encourage you to Google News Corp and just look at some of the brands. I was surprised. I double checked today to see how many brands are wrapped in. So it's an enormous amount of content. And in Omelas, we collect data on 152 actors, and Russia alone produces over a third of that content, even though it's just 1 out of 152 actors, which is just enormous. And then I also want to say kind of preemptively, so 2020 is definitely not 2016. So we do have a report is linked to the end of this presentation where we talk a bit about what's happened this election. There were things, some like phishing attacks, other things like that, but definitely not a lot of the covert actions that we saw in 2016. I'm sure you're all still tired of hearing about the DNC hacks, the email leaks, all those things. That did not happen in 2020. But what did happen was still and consistently a large swath of media aimed at the American populace. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see kind of an example of what that is. So Russian IO is really its own microcosm, a huge microcosm of spectacle and content that really hits across the full political spectrum. So on this slide, literally on the left of this slide, but also politically on the left, is a post from RT. It's an RT program, Russia Today, that is geared to the left, but at the same time, and these are both from just within the past month or two, a really sensational post discussing vaccination and people's personal health, I guess, that's kind of geared towards the right. And what's interesting about this is like, we don't really expect this to have influence on the American populace, right? You can give me very similar examples from some homegrown media in the United States that is just as ridiculous and just as polarized as this. But as we'll see, and if we go to the next slide, that's not always true. So I was about to say friends, but I shouldn't say that. This interesting think tank, Center for Research on Globalization, did publish some thought pieces on the unrest following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 being a color revolution, which is like calling back to a like civil type of uprising. It has a really interesting history in the Caucasus. I encourage you to read about like the Rose Revolution or the Orange Revolution, which I had actually not heard of before I started working at Omelas. Has a really interesting history. But so color revolution is a really popular trope in Russian media, and it's kind of a term that we keep track of. And so in this case, it did originate from Global Research, and it was heavily seen on Russia Today's media, but then also heavily seen on Fox News. I want to be careful and like not assert causality here and say like because Russians produces content that it ended up on Fox News. But it is the case, like there's this large swath of a somewhat unusual term, I think, for the average American to be consuming in media. And it came heavily in these Russian-backed media entities, and then it also appeared on Fox News. Whereas before we had this broad, vast media just pushed at the American public kind of all over the place. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about kind of this high level again. So similar to what Roberto was saying, we have all of these brands within the Russian government. So Sputnik, TASS, Russia Today, there are all these big media entities, all with their own brands, as we saw with RT, some on the left, some on the right, some in the middle, some super factual, some not so factual, but it's all really sensational. And so you plug that into mostly Facebook and YouTube that are really geared towards capturing clicks and engagement with sensational content, and people that are seeing some more factual articles eventually may see some things that aren't necessarily true. And so Russia's really good at just scaling out content and allowing these private social media firms to really do the dirty work of sending out all of this information for them. And just like China, Russia has this huge following with 57 million followers on YouTube. But in my opinion, I think Russian IO has tons of engagement, even from non-followers. So in the 2 months before the 2020 election, just YouTube content originating from Russian media had over 1 billion views in just 2 months before the election, which is just astounding to me. So I'm also now going to talk about how we get this data. If we go to the next slide. So we collect data on 13, we call them platforms. So this includes social media, your typical things like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. We also do RSS feeds. We also go out onto the web and collect some articles that may be mentioned in a social media post. And then we also have social media that you might not have heard of. So Aparat is one. It's a like primarily Farsi language kind of YouTube site. It's very popular in the Middle East and the Arab world. And then Vikante is a Facebook lookalike site that's extremely popular in Russia. And so we do this. If you go to the next slide, please. It starts with people. So there's another half of the company that is people with an intelligence background, security background, and they do really interesting, I think more interesting than my job, but also much harder in researching all of these corporate structures for all these media entities, and they decide what accounts we're going to collect. We're not just dredging up the whole internet, and sticking it in a dashboard. That wouldn't really be helpful for anybody or for us. And I should say that when they do that, we do not collect any like individual accounts. We're collecting BBC, RT America, like these organizations. We do collect like official accounts for like at POTUS, or the Secretary of State's Twitter account, but it's like an official account for the office. We're not following individuals. We don't gel with that ethically. And so once those accounts are in the system, we have a full suite of cloud native microservices that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. But for each platform, we collect that data, the engagement, the content, and then we send that all out to a suite of natural language processing microservices that Roberto's going to go a little more in depth on in a second. All of that goes back in the data store, and it's all looked at by people again, so they can write these really interesting reports that we've talked about, that we've linked to in the presentation, and then also for further research on what accounts we should collect next. So now I'm going to pass it back to Roberto, and he's going to tell you all about that fun NLP stuff.
Thanks, Nick. So as Nick said, we basically only deal with text data. And in order to make sense of very, very large data sets of text, you really have to, we just make use of a lot of natural language processing techniques. So as I was talking before, we have these stories which feature very prominently in our dashboard. And the way they are created is we first get all of this content, get all of this articles, etc. We vectorize each one, which just means representing text in this mathematical form, which is a vector. And then we run it on a text clustering algorithm. The specific one we use for anyone that's interested is called dbScan. It stands for, I actually have it written somewhere here, density-based spatial clustering of application with noise. So that's quite a mouthful. It really doesn't matter. I obviously do not know that off the top of my head. But the important thing to understand from this is that the way it works, it basically groups together points, as is shown in this figure. It groups together points that are close to each other or are in high density regions. And then it labels as noise those that are in low density regions. So for those who have a little bit of knowledge or have taken a class on unsupervised learning, the very first algorithm we learn about in those classes is this algorithm called k-means. And unlike k-means, what's very powerful about dbScan is that it labels certain points noise, which is super useful when you're dealing with very noisy and unstructured data like text is. So with that, I do want to say that as everyone who has dealt with real world data before, you always expect it to be, beautiful. The trend is super visible and obvious as soon as you plot it on an XY graph. But the reality is, it's very messy, very noisy, just very hard to deal with. So we do try to be a data-centric company, which means basically that, sophisticated AI and NLP just can't really solve all your problems. And as Nick said, we keep human experts in the loop, both ourselves as engineers. We're constantly, reviewing models to try to understand what the errors are, conducting error analysis, et cetera, and then really working much more on getting high quality data rather than, just throwing the most recent neural network or whatever fancy algorithm that was just developed by Google or, the people at OpenAI. So it's really a data-centric approach to our analysis. And with that, I will open it up to questions. And here's a beautiful cat doing some fingernail work.
Nice. Thank you, Roberto and Nick. And Nick, I didn't realize you came to Hacknet too. That's wonderful. Both of you are alums or members. Yeah, we have lots of questions. Ryan and I have a lot. I know that other folks have started to ask a few in the live chat. But maybe Ryan, do you want to ask your first question? I think I see here.
Sure. So from a global perspective, who is most susceptible to or closely following the CCP's narrative? Any particular populations or demographics that they most often reach or are highly influenced?
That's a tough one. I'll try to take a stab at it. So most of the media organizations that we talked about, so like the Global Times, CGTN, their main audience is English-speaking individuals. So they do have basically a very sparse amount of followers in, I want to say, almost every English-speaking country. but they are actually now investing much more in Spanish-speaking countries such as Mexico, Latin America, Venezuela, etc., as well as Arabic-speaking countries in the Middle East. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure. There probably is, not a perfectly distributed following, but in general, it is like really casting a very wide net to get people from all over the world. I don't know if Nick, you want to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, the one thing I'll add, so like, that's a really good question. And that's like exactly the question that we build our tools for. So something we allow like Intel analysts to do that use our product is they can be like, okay, I want to see all of the content published by China and then targeting, all of these different actors or countries. And then you can kind of see the engagement or like even just the content targeting certain countries.
Cool, thank you.
I'll go to one of the audience questions. So given the scale of the CCP social media operations, I'm curious how many of their reported followers are actually legitimate across platforms. So I suppose, there's maybe bots, right, that are in those counts. Do you know?
I would say it's safe to assume probably a fair amount, just for like any, that's something like it would be cool if we could tell, but I guess if companies could tell easily, then they wouldn't be as big a problem. I do remember seeing a stat that like for some accounts, like almost half can be bots sometimes. So yeah, I would imagine a fair number, but also a fair number that aren't bots too, just because there are that many followers.
Okay, so do you incorporate social network analysis to identify distributors of disinformation?
So I want to be a little careful with this. Disinformation is a complicated term. So we actually don't really try to, say what's real versus what's not real. We're just trying to analyze propaganda, which is information with some sort of agenda. We did at some point actually have network analysis. I think it's super, super interesting. And we tried to use it because it allows for very beautiful and insightful visualizations. But it was very hard because we're dealing with, just so much text that when we did do it, it was just very noisy and it wasn't completely clear what it was giving us. So as of now, we actually don't really use that.
All right, next question. This is actually one I had. So could you talk more about the scale of the state-run misinformation campaigns in comparison to like our homegrown misinformation networks from US sources? I understand that they're different in nature, right? One is a state-sponsored kind of, you showed like a top-down model, and I would assume that it's maybe more of a collective going on in the US, but I know it's not something you explicitly track, or maybe you do, but you just haven't mentioned it. But can you sort of talk about how these things compare, and maybe and also maybe their scales? Do you have a sense about how big one is versus the other?
Yeah, so we're in the beginnings as a company, like starting to collect metrics for like private media orgs, particularly in the States, because that is an interesting question, right? It would be amazing to see, did this type of content like start in an actor and migrate its way through the mediaverse? For scaling, I would say like the one difference that comes to mind for me is like with Russia, the amount of variation just coming out is just like insane. The goal there is to just get content out so that a user is then hooked into their system of information. So like if one RT brand like catches my eye on a YouTube, and then like eventually other videos like originating from Russian content that may not necessarily be explicitly related will be recommended to me. That's kind of similar, I guess, like private orgs still want you to like engage with more of their content. But I think like state influence operations typically cast a wider net than maybe kind of homegrown misinformation. Like, there's people in the US that are very anti-vax and like that's their thing. Whereas, these state actors, they have all sorts of things. They just want to catch a lot of attention. And I would also say, sorry, this thought just slipped from me. Oh, right. So there's a kind of like, there's a little bit of the political high level stuff. So for like, particularly the Chinese example, The COVID case isn't necessarily the only case where they want to position democracies as being ineffective. You'll see articles about, hey, look, China just built this amazing highway in like 2 days. The US can't do that because they have all these bureaucratic problems. Look how wasteful and like poor off like people living in democracies are. And so like there's a kind of a longer running theme that comes out of state IO that isn't necessarily, it doesn't come to the surface unless you're kind of looking at it a long scale, but it has these kind of long-term, really like subtle things that they're pushing over time, I would say.
We'll add one tiny thing. Obviously, the US, the UK, et cetera, they're not perfect either. So I would encourage people to check out VOA. So that's Voice of America. That's sort of the, I guess, CGTN of the US in a way. The big difference, I would say, is that, democracies, we do have independent journalism and media. There's obviously, hidden agendas there from funders, et cetera. But as you said, Derek, it's not that much top down as it is in autocratic governments. And, ideally in countries like the US, media really holds governments to account. We see, media in the US criticizing our own government all the time. And you really don't see that in places like China or Russia.
So in the People Cloud Python Postgres, sorry if I mispronounced that, diagram, can you say a little bit more about the different tools and services you use?
Yeah, so we are primarily an AWS shop on the back end. So our client-facing tools use Google Cloud. So we really kind of have two pools of microservices. So a lot of it is ETL, and the other stuff is more the NLP analytics stuff. Kind of at a high level, there's really just like a big stream. And so we have Lambda functions for AWS folks, but it's basically a very lightweight micro container that executes just this really small business process really easily. So we're a very lean team, so it saves us a lot of trouble on server configuration, all that good stuff. And it's also fairly cost effective. And so basically all the platforms have some sort of ingestion tool that starts on Lambda. And so like Twitter's really nice. They give us an API. Some other of these platforms, we create custom software with kind of the usual suspects like Beautiful Soup or Selenium and Friends, that kind of stuff. We pull in that content and then we kind of daisy chain it down the stream to, processing engagement, sending it off for, we do translate everything. Roberto, maybe you know how many languages we have, but it's a lot more than I can remember. All that gets translated in a service and it kind of continues on until it ends up in Postgres. We're kind of for folks that might be curious about like the big data stuff, we as a company are getting there as far as like the need for it. But fortunately, we've been very, targeted, having the Intel side of the house really decide on what accounts that we need. And then like the business case of we don't need to, show these tweets to people like as soon as they come out. There's a few hours, that we can batch things. We don't really have like a huge volume or velocity yet for some of these like really crazy big data tools. So Postgres, works just fine for us.
Cool. That's actually a good segue into a question I was thinking. Just about sort of the relationship between the technical team, which you two are both on, and then the researcher side. How do the researchers access the data? Do they use that dashboard that you showed a screenshot of, Roberto, or are you teaching them how to use like SQL? Like how does that information get kind of turned into something that's usable by folks who don't have like a technical background?
Yeah, we like to think that our analysts are like our most important customers for the engineering team because they heavily use our dashboard. And we actually, just recently, we started having meetings, for example, Nick and I, with our analysts to really just ask them, like, what can we do better? What can we do worse? How can we improve the dashboard? Et cetera, et cetera. So they primarily interact with our data through the dashboard, but we also actually provide an API to clients with, I think Nick might be able to talk about a little more in detail.
Yeah, we offer an API, and it's really any of the data that you could want. I want this content from this actor on this platform in this time, that kind of thing. You can ask for content based on like a query string as far as the API. We also have started dabbling with some like internal reporting tools for the analysts so they can like really get a summary of information that's going on. But they use all of the products any external client would use. And then also I like for as far as kind of the interaction piece between us and them, because this is my favorite part of working in Omelas. So like on Monday, we have a big stand up and the first part of it is what's going on in the world. Some of that is, just external news and the expertise of other people in the company. A lot of it is, just looking at the data in our tool and being able to see this landscape of news. And then on Friday, we have, discussions on ethics, either like AI ethics, data ethics, as well as just foreign policy and more, at least for me, it's like, I'm very happy of this personal education I get from them. There's a lot of back and forth, and I think over time, they pick up some technical skills. I know one of our analysts had learned SQL pretty recently, so it's definitely we're a small company, and I think we all get along really well too.
So what are some of the trickiest technical challenges in your work? So are the challenges in your organization greater on the technical or research side?
That's a hard one. I don't know if I would say they're greater on one side or the other. I think they're great on both sides, honestly. I'm obviously, more or less narrow in my vision because I primarily work on the engineering side of things. I can say that in data science, a lot of our problems, as I talked about before, is just the nature of language, of using language as data. It's extremely unstructured. It's really hard, especially when you're dealing with the web and all of these different social media platforms and then custom software that we use. You get a lot of noise, whether it be, different things from the href or the HTML page of the things that we compile, and then cleaning that up in order to then feed into our NLP algorithms is really, I want to say, where I at least spend the bulk of my time. We all want to think that data science is, 90% building super cool models, but in reality, I feel like it's like 95%. I would say 50% trying to install things on your computer, then 45% working on cleaning data, and then like 5% actually working on cool models. So yeah, just the unstructured nature of data that we deal with, I think, presents, the highest challenge.
Right on. Sounds like if you don't use Docker, I don't know, at least I found that it's like the whole dependency, like headache, like at least it's reduced that quite a bit for me.
Oh yeah, no, I've banged my head against some errors that, it works perfectly here, and then push it and it just everything breaks.
So maybe this is a question I have, which is it almost feels like so obvious, but I feel like I gotta ask it, right? It's like, so you know who that bad actors are, you have them named, exactly like who they work for and what they're doing and why. Why are they still allowed to post? Is there any, who can stop them? Why don't they?
Yeah, I should preface this as personal opinion, maybe. Right, and also, so I mean, yeah, that is the question, right? I think what's really, we do spend quite a few Fridays talking about this of what is to be done. It will be and is becoming a really big area of policy, right? Just how are we going to regulate what is happening in this space? And some of that is representatives actually knowing what the space is and what the technologies are, as we've seen kind of recently again with hearings and kind of scary questions and answers. And then also it's really hard to just pass any legislation currently, it seems. So I would say it's kind of sad, it feels like a non-answer, but from the bottom up, so a couple of weeks ago, there is a lot of really interesting internal reporting about Facebook. And, if data scientists are knowingly building models where angry content gets five times the weight of content people liked, somebody should have just stopped and, hey, maybe this is going to have outcomes that aren't necessarily great. It's gonna take the people that are building these systems to really consider the ethical and like long societal implications of their work, I think, to change it in the near future, unless we have some really large political shift that allows us to do any sort of policy measures.
So were there
Yeah, one more.
any unexpected clusters or results you saw using or looking at the NLP data?
Yeah, we get unexpected clusters all the time. So again, I know I'm like really just talking all the time about the difficulty and how noisy it is, but we actually get, our product is obviously not perfect, and there's a lot of room for improvement. So with that specific clustering technique, it works so well, I guess, sometimes in like the mathematical terms, that it really does create clusters that when you look at them, they make sense in a mathematical frame of view. It's clustering things like cookies, different privacy policies that we catch when we're trying to process the HTMLs of pages. And obviously, that's not a story that we want to put for our clients because they don't really care about the cookie policy of whatever company, but it does get clustered by the algorithm itself. It also, that said, we also do get super interesting topics about just what issues, what narratives different countries are really talking about in a day-to-day. So this algorithm actually runs every day. And the way it does it is that with the new data that we pull in a day, it matches those new clusters to clusters that were created in the past. And then depending on some parameters, it either joins them or creates new clusters. So you kind of get a real-time view of like the information in the World Wide Web, at least in the things that we compile. And you can see how different countries like China, like Russia, like Venezuela, from Mexico, we've recently incorporated a lot of information from Mexico, just what they're talking about in general, what their main issues are, what their main topics are, and what the information they want to get out there is.
And I would also add kind of on the other end of that spectrum, just like content I wasn't really expecting to like come across when I started Omelas. It's just kind of like how much state-owned media is like silly or outlandish. There was a CCP like YouTube channel, just like a bunch of panda videos, just things like that. Like when you hear like headlines about influence operations and like misinformation, there's a lot of, benign, but also, boring and outlandish media that all comes in that I was just really surprised to come across.
I guess just to tie back to our presentation, that's the idea of information laundering, right? How they really mix. It's not that, everything that CGTN publish is terrible. No, not at all. There's quality things, there's non-quality things, there's panda videos, and there's propaganda. And that's what makes it so difficult for the reader to really differentiate what is, quality reporting without a clear agenda and what is just plain propaganda.
I think maybe you have time for one last question. One that I kind of had, just you mentioned sort of you have APIs that your clients use. Could you talk a little bit about like who your clients are? And then also, you'd also mentioned things around like, the ethics is a big conversation topic, something you care deeply about your organization. How do you make sure that clients don't potentially like misuse or do harm with the data that your platform collects?
Sure. Yeah. So like two of our really big clients are USAID, USAID, and like the State Department. And kind of like the big lift we provide to like an intel analyst at State is, they might want all of what has China been saying about the US leaving Afghanistan the past 3 months? And like, that's a really daunting task if you have to scour the web, find all that stuff. Sometimes you have to translate it because it might not just be in English or Chinese, or, there's a whole swath of languages. And so we're, really able to save them a lot of time so they can get to this high level thinking to do whatever it is they need to do. For me, and I'll definitely pass to Roberto because he'll have probably a more interesting thing to say about it. For me, so me as like the engineer in my role, like I consider my ethical obligation to make sure it's all running is like, I need to provide an accurate and complete picture of the data to them. So if the translating service is not working for like Korean or something, then like I might be biasing that intel analyst's view of like what's gonna, the impact of that just from like a language for a certain population, which would be extremely concerning. Or if, a service goes down and I'm missing a swath of content from a certain brand and that leads them to an incorrect conclusion because they didn't have all the information presented to them. So that's something I particularly think about. But I'll pass to Roberto because him doing the modeling, he has more interesting questions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is a complicated subject. It is something that we have very present in our minds. So what actually last year, where I was still part-time, we worked on a couple of months on like a data ethics framework. So one of the things, as Nick said during the presentation, that's very important for us is we don't compile any individual level information at all, period. Another thing that we try to do that we started to implement, I guess, are two things. One is whenever we start a new NLP project, we kind of try to have a brainstorming and discussion between the company and between the engineers of, what potential harms our product could have, what potential biases the model could have, or more than the model itself, the data that we're using to train the model, what that could have. Thankfully, since we're not, again, working with individual level or any demographic data, then we're somewhat protected in that sense. But obviously, there's a lot of shortcomings that we can have. And the way we try to do it is just having very open discussions and really thinking about all of the different ways that something could go wrong or something could be misused, and trying to design our products so that we limit all of those misuses.
Yeah. And I will add, just make sure we answer the last part of your question too, is the other side of the house. I mean, we're a small company, so we all talk about, once a week, like what's going on with clients and who they are and everything. And so those clients, before they're given any of our tools or things, like they're properly vetted and trained by the other side of the house to, make sure they're using the tool effectively and not misusing it.
Great, thanks for that. If only the platforms you monitored spent as much time considering the ethical implications of their tools.
Yeah.
What a world.
In a perfect world.
Well, with that, thank you both, Roberto and Nick, for your time. We're just actually a little bit over. So thank you again for presenting. This is a super fascinating subject. I think, obviously just like the tip of the iceberg in terms of just how much there is to it. But there's a lot for folks to dive into from this. So I really appreciate your time and expertise on this.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was great.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. I think the only thing left is we had to do our catchphrase, right, Ryan?
Yes. On 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Go forth and hack. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you over in the post Zoom. We'll share.